welcome to everyone who joins us today virtually in this space of dialogue around one of the most important and influential figures in Puerto Rican contemporary history, Ricardo Alegría, a man that changed and helped frame and redefine the way we perceive our culture and our very own sense of what it means to be Puerto Rican. His legacy has received all the praise and glory it deserves, but also a considerable and way just, we might say, amount of criticism. And for that, and for many other reasons, to revisit his ideas and vision is a task for every generation of Puerto Ricans to come. I am Ana Teresa Toro, and it's a pleasure to serve as moderator during this conversation that is held in the context of the celebration of the Puerto Rican Heritage Month and the BORIMIX Festival that is dedicated this year to the commemorations and festivities of the 500 years of foundation of our capital city of San Juan. We gather here today in a very historical place itself, the archives of Fundación Luis Muñoz Marín in Trujillo Alto, Puerto Rico. And we're here to analyze the story and the history of a man that transformed so much for all of us in the island and all around the world. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to give a special thanks to the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, Hunter College, CUNY, for organizing this event. That is going to be the first of 3 similar forums on different topics that will be available online the next Tuesday of the month. All of our gratitude as well for Yarimar Bonilla, Interim Director of El Centro, and to Ángel Antonio Ruiz Lavoy, Associate Director of Arts and Culture. Also to our partners in this endeavor, our friends from the Clemente Soto Vélez Cultural and Educational Center, Teatro SEA and Teatro Latea. I think that if you're Puerto Rican and you've been around New York, you've been to one of these places before or to all of them. But most importantly, to everyone who is watching and will watch this video online. Thank you for your interest in Puerto Rican history, our stories, and our voices. Now, I want to proceed to present to you 2 distinguished members of Puerto Rican cultural and intellectual scene. Let me begin with academic, writer, literary critic, journalist, and one of the most beautiful persons that I know, a true advocate for humanities, Carmen Dolores Hernández. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you, Ana Teresa. I'm very, very happy to be here. And I'm very, very grateful to BORIMIX Festival, to the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, to have invited me today.
Thank you. Also, I want to present to you writer, historian, academic, poet, cultural agitator, co-host of Marullo with me and Silverio Perez, my friend Pedro Reina Perez. Welcome.
Delighted to be here. First time I'm going to get a chance to talk to Carmen Dolores about Don Ricardo. So
That's wonderful.
Yeah, this is we're in the middle of a moment. Something is happening here because they are both the biographers of this monumental figure in Puerto Rico, and they've never got a chance to speak publicly about their work. So this is a very, very special opportunity. They have a lot of things in common, but of course the one that have us in this moment is the fact that you both spend a lot of time, a lot of hours listening, thinking, asking questions. Carmen Dolores' book is called Ricardo Alegría Una Vida, and Pedro's book is called La Semilla que Sembramos. And both books share intimate and the bigger picture of everything around this figure. So let's start from that seed, from that title that you selected that has a lot to do with yours as well. How would you describe that seed? What was the genesis of the vision of Ricardo Alegría from both of your perspectives?
Well, the first thing I have to say is that having interviewed Ricardo Alegría for 5 years in a row, having sat listening to his stories, listening to his life, I came to a wonderful appreciation of the man. But even I could say even more than that. I got an appreciation of how history has been made. Okay, because you generally study history, you read about history, you know things that have happened, you know people associated with things that have happened, but you rarely get a glimpse behind the scenes. And this, to have written this biography of Don Ricardo Alegría, gave me a unique glimpse behind the scenes. I could see how, for example, the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture, when I became aware of things, it was already in place, it was already functioning. But how did it happen to come into existence? What were the negotiations, the transactions, even the misunderstandings? How did things become done? It's not that they became done by a work of magic or or by chance. It was because somebody had planned and had maybe had a few problems, and then the manner in which they were resolved, and it was also, I could see, and I believe that now, many of the things that we count as history are the product of fortuitous meetings, of things that happened because somebody knew somebody and somebody else was ready for to take one or the other step in his life. And so it's kind of I don't mean magic, but it's kind of like a toss up sometimes. That things were directed this way and not that way. And that's what I really, really remember about my feelings when I was talking with him. And also the wonderful person that he was personally. He was a very understanding, very intelligent, very gracious person. All the time I interviewed him, he was extremely gracious, extremely nice to me, and he was very open. And I have to say, he had a tremendous memory because everything he said, I corroborated later. Okay, he told me about this, that, and the other, and how he became the first director of the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture, but he had been director of the museum at the University of Puerto Rico. He had been acting director of the museum. How he had come to be interested in archaeology from a very young age. What were his interests when he was young, and all of this was just a revelation for me. It was wonderful to hear it from his lips, and I think because I have read your book, Pedro, that my experience with Don Ricardo was a little different than yours in the sense that we didn't talk politics all that much. We did talk about how things came to be and his friendship with Luis Muñoz Marin and his knowledge of other people that were very influential at the time. But we really didn't talk about politics, more about his trajectory as a man of institutions, because if something characterized Ricardo Alegría was his belief in the power of institutions. He said he didn't want. Would you agree on that?
Oh yeah, certainly. Just for the audience, we didn't get to read each other's books because
No.
we were working on them at the same time.
Yeah, simultaneously.
And evidently my approach was not as academic, as rigorous as Carmen Dolores was. The idea for my book came out of a series of conversations that I was having with him since 1993. Ricardo Alegría was a larger than life figure for anyone who lived in San Juan. He was there. He would
In
walk.
his balcony.
He would walk the
Yeah.
streets
Say hello
every
to
afternoon,
everyone.
go to the
His
post office.
guayabera.
Yeah.
Sharp every afternoon. He would stop at here and there and talk to people. So you knew Ricardo Alegría. I joined the Centro de Estudios Avanzados de Puerto Rico y el Caribe for my master's in 1998, right after college. And that's when I became more acquainted with him, and I found out how generous he was, because he would, you know, his
Very
office was
generous.
open to anyone who would come knocking on the door. And I did, because you had to take this year-long course on Puerto Rican culture, and you had to do a research project the second semester. And I went to his office to pick his brain, and he was very generous. You know, he told me stories. And a few years later, I went to work for the Fundación Puertorriqueña de las Humanidades, which was also in Old San Juan, and there I got to talk to him regularly, all the time. I started collaborating with the Museo de las Américas, and I was very interested in, you know, his anecdotes.
Oh yeah,
And-
and he was very accessible, Pedro, don't you think?
Exactly.
Very,
And then one
very
day I
accessible.
told him, you know, we should do something with these conversations. Would you mind if I bring a recorder and we start doing it for the record? And I realized, you know, one dimension of Ricardo Alegría that is very important is that he was a political animal. I mean, this is a person with full knowledge of who he was. He had full awareness of the weight his words carried. So I discovered very fast that the Don Ricardo I was speaking to, when the recorder was off, suddenly disappeared when the recorder was on. There was, you know, he was very scripted in
Wow.
certain things.
Pedro, I didn't have that experience at all.
No, I for the longest time, it's a good thing you pick up on the fact that I try to speak politics with him, because one of the things I wanted to understand is he was a larger than life figure. Okay, great. People had opinions about him even when he was alive. So, you know, he was mostly admired and everything, but he had, you know, his critics. And I wanted to learn things beyond the admiration. I wanted to know, for example, and this is one of the first chapters, and you cover it really well. Who does he recognize as mentors? You know,
was
to whom?
interesting.
What does he feel gratitude? Because I said this man must have been nurtured by so many people,
And he was.
and exactly. And I wanted to know, who do you thank?
And
Who do
he
you when? You know, and the
Who
first
do you
one,
admire?
for example, the biggest surprise to me, one of the first names he mentioned was Jaime Benitez.
Benitez.
And I had thought of Jaime Benitez as his
enemy.
adversary.
It has his adversary, exactly.
And then all of a sudden he goes, no, I owe a debt of gratitude to Jaime Benitez. I'm like, what? And he's like, he was my teacher at the university, he was
Yeah.
my professor, I owe him.
Can you give us a little bit of context about why will they be considered adversaries for our
Well,
audience?
to you know, say it succinctly, the University of Puerto Rico under Jaime Benitez embraced
Universality.
universality.
You know,
Exactly. Puerto Rico was part of the Western
culture.
tradition.
Exactly.
And Alegría, one thing one needs to understand, he came from privilege. His family was, you know, well off. His mother was from Loíza, which is, you know, mostly Afro descendant town, and his father was from Dorado or
His father was from Dorado, the son of a Spaniard. So he had that aristocratic, you know, kind of.
So
street.
he was raised in Old San Juan, but his childhood basically moved around Loíza, which is like a completely different universe from Old San Juan or from Dorado. So he had an inclination to anthropology from a very young age, like Carmen Dolores was saying. So Jaime Benitez was more in the Western canon, you
So
know.
it was an ideological.
Yes.
And
Right.
he advocated, Benitez, for an education that was centered around the classics and you know, the Western tradition. Alegría was all for that, but he also wanted to study what did it mean to be in the Caribbean, what does it mean to be, you know, how do we deal with race?
What does it mean to be Puerto Rican and Caribbean?
So when Alegría, you know, did his studies at the School of Social Sciences, he did the first documentary on La Fiesta de Santiago Apóstol de Loíza. It's an 11-minute film that everyone should film.
He was still
When
a
he did
student.
And it's an 11-minute film it's very revealing. You can hear the narrator speaking as an ethnographer about what he's seeing, La Fiesta and everything. He brought the movie to Benitez one day, and he said, I want to show you this. And he tells this anecdote that Benitez didn't see the whole film before standing up and saying, that's not Puerto Rico. because his
It's
vision.
not Puerto Rico. Can you imagine that?
That's,
Because it was, the black people from Loíza.
So that's why we consider them adversaries, because we know. He goes, no, I owe Benitez a little gratitude because he was a great teacher. I'm like, I wouldn't have imagined that was the case.
You both have given us an example of one of his major accomplishments, that it was dignifying and giving a proper space for our culture in all of its perspectives and diversity, and leveling up and giving dignity. I believe dignity might be the proper word.
I would think so, yeah.
But of course, there were different visions, and later on it did became problematic, because when you have a project, a vision, and he did, and I think that's in both of your works, that vision, that idea of how we should present, defend, preserve, develop our cultural, political policy, public policy. I mean, a lot of things needs to be left behind in order to move forward a project, and it might be great in a moment, but then when you see time pass, you think, well, what was left behind, what wasn't considered in this project, why this is no longer serving us the same, and it's problematic, without, of course, taking away the enormous value and the enormous life's work that he did. And if we have something that we could consider Puerto Rican culture the way we see it today, even if we don't share that idea, it was in a great level because of him. So what were those things that were problematic? What were those things that were left behind in his project? And what do we do with that today?
Well, I think that's a very thought-provoking question, Teresa. First, I just want to tell Pedro, he was a political animal, but he was not a partisan animal.
No.
He was not a partisan figure at all, because he was not. Even though practically the whole of his work, for early work, was done under the auspices of the Popular Democratic Party, he always said he was not a popular. He told me several times he was not a popular, even less republicano,
Yeah.
a Republican, even less. His father had been the founder of the Nationalist Party before Albizu Campos came into the Nationalist Party, founded in 1922 by Coli Cuchi, Jose Alegria, who was his father, and a couple of other professional men. He was always in favor of Puerto Rican sovereignty. Always. That's what he always emphasized. But he said he would collaborate. He told me that several times. He would collaborate with whomever defended Puerto Rican culture, and whoever made it easy for him to promote Puerto Rican culture. That's how you say, what was left behind? Well, I'm trying to think about that. But the thing is that I think we can't judge his actions with today's set of mind. Because when he began his work, first in the Museum of the University of Puerto Rico, and then in the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture, at that time, he became head of the museum in 1943, 1944, around that time. It wasn't the museum we see now. It was in the basement of what was called the registry building at the university.
It was more a collection of
It
objects.
was more a collection, yeah. But it was the only collection.
It was Rafael W. Ramirez's
Exactly,
collection
his
that
teacher.
evolved into.
Exactly. In fact, he became head of the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture just as the new building for the museum was being built. So at that time, neither was there a museographic culture, nor was there a great appreciation for anthropological and archaeological digs, and like Pedro said, the encounter between Benitez and him when he showed his film to Benitez, Black culture was not even considered culture. Black culture at that time was like it was something that was absolutely out of the radar. For example, when Luis Pales Matos began writing his black poetry, there was a critic that said that it had nothing to do with Puerto Rico. That kind of poetry has nothing to do. And the intimate friend of Luis Pales Matos, Jose Isaac Cedillo Padrón, said, el disparate de la poesía negra en Puerto Rico. So you see, there was not realization at all. Culture was what Benitez more or less figured it should be, elitist, Eurocentric, Hispanocentric also. Benitez was a little more, wide in his contemplation of culture, but that was culture. That was what was culture. It's not,
And before you go there, will you consider that mainly it was because of his work through the government that changed?
I have to think that to a certain degree it began to change. There was an awareness. Right now there's a lot of criticism because the seal of the Institute of Puerto Rico has three figures. The Spaniard in the center, which is an object of criticism because he's in the center. The black man on one side and the Indian. But that was a feat at that time, because for everybody, every cultured, more or less cultured people, for cultured, the cultured class in Puerto Rico, not everybody, but for the most part, culture was this Hispanocentric learning, Eurocentric arts. There was no awareness at all that Puerto Rican culture could include this diversity that included black culture and Indian. So that it was like something exotic. I think up to a point it was a defensive way of preserving certain attributes that were thought to be better in social terms, like very white skin and it's Castilian grammar, pure Castilian grammar, and things like that. There really wasn't an awareness of that diversity. That's what I think, Pedro. What do you think?
I think you called me an agitator
You
when
are.
you presented me, and
You
I
are.
want to bring that up because I think they say luck is when preparation meets opportunity, and Alegría, in a certain way, embodied that, because not only did he was educated here, he attended the University of Puerto Rico. His father was a well-connected man. He obviously had academic interests. He was taught by Inés María Mendoza, who later became Luis Muñoz Marin's wife, and she was a mentor to him. He was very young, and Alegría was relentless. He encountered a lot of opposition. For example, within the Popular Democratic Party, yes, culture was great, but you had Fomento, la compañía de Fomento, trying to bring money and investors to Puerto Rico, putting together cultural presentations such as the Festival Casals, which was created not under the wing of the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture, but under Fomento, because it was focused to different public in the island, but mainly outside. And they saw Alegría and his proposal of the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture as something suspicious because of what Carmen Dolores was saying. If anyone wants to track this discussion, they should look at the legislature. The legislative record has a very neat tracking of how this idea evolved. Some people question the fact that it was called the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture. Some people thought it should be called the Puerto Rican Institute of Culture.
Sí.
because they called it la cultura de los bacalaitos fritos, and I'm quoting him. They were saying like, what are you gonna cultura puertorriqueña? What do
They
you
said
mean?
there was no culture. There was no culture to defend.
That there was no such thing
There was
as
as
Puerto
Puerto
Rican
Rican
culture,
Except
yes.
for bacalaitos,
Yeah.
and because obviously, aside from him being relentless, he was also very creative and very didactic. He wanted to
Yes.
create an institution that would educate, not just an institution that would exist, but an institution that would put out magazines and writing original writings about music and culture
and it was successful
and
for
visual
a
arts
long time.
and museums and popular music. So people in a way, as Carmen Dolores was saying, nobody was talking about this. I mean, if you were
Nobody.
attended the schools in Puerto Rico, the curriculum was, Washington, Lincoln, the Constitution, and 4th of July, because that until at least until 1947, that was the curriculum. And
That was it.
he knew there was a void. I mean, people knew about traditions locally. People from Loíza would know something. People in Ay Bonito would know something, but people from Ay Bonito would not know about Loíza. So he knew there was an opportunity there to make connections. And the more opposition he encountered, for example, from the university, which said nothing to do here, he was relentless in finding ways. And the one track, I don't know if you agree with me, the one thing that was the jackpot for him was the Department of Education, because nobody opposed the fact that he would write a book, Mi Primer Libro de Puerto Rico. So he realized that from a very early age, he could produce materials that would be used in schools, that would become instruction material for kids. And at the time it was called Departamento de Instrucción Pública. They became sort of a partner to what he was doing. So he started doing
Was
children's books.
Mariano Villaronga, who was a very wide-minded secretary of education.
So we all talk about all the stuff he did. You could just focus on the children's books he put together. It was a very clever way to put out part of what he was doing, talking to children. And to me, and for me as a historian, it is part of the explanation of why my generation came up with a vernacular knowledge of Puerto Rican culture, because we started learning about the Indians. Who would oppose talking about the Indians? They wouldn't talk about the Africans. That's problematic.
It wouldn't even talk about
But they did talk about the Indians. But even so, it was something. It was our Indians. It was not, the Cherokee or the Navajo. No disrespect to them, but we were taught a history that had very little to do with us. And he found a way that coincided also with a bigger political project, being undertaken by the Partido Popular, to use culture as an avenue for pride. So he sort of figured out a way to operate within that realm. What is problematic about it? Well, ironically, his father, Alegria's father, was a founder of the Nationalist Party. Which I thought it was fascinating, because here is a guy who is collaborating with Muñoz Marin, but his father is the founder of the Nationalist Party. The Nationalist Party was the biggest adversary Muñoz Marin had, and yet his son is working with him, and evidently it is not only race that one finds absent in what race in a more critical way. Absent from the project, but also the fact that nacionalistas, members of the Nationalist Party, were being persecuted in the 1940s and 50s. So this was the backdrop to most of his work. There was the gag law, or la ley de la mordaza, which basically made it illegal to proclaim or to speak against the U.S. government in Puerto Rico.
or to hire nationalists. And the first thing he did when he became director of the institute was to hire two nationalists. One was Roberto Villacocchea Lota, who became his assistant, and the other one was Isabel Gutierrez del Arroyo, who was a historian, a nationalist historian. And one of the members of the governing board of the institute was no one less than Trias Monge, who was the Secretary of Justice, who had promulgated the gag law, la ley de la mordaza. So here we have a governing board of the institute, in which Jose Diaz Monge is a prominent member, and we have the director hiring, contrary to the government's laws, two nationalists. So what gives? You know what gives.
So that's one of the criticisms leveled at his work. But he didn't stop. He continued working, and I think one of his biggest contributions is putting together a corpus of knowledge that became widespread and that taught Puerto Ricans about their history and a version of their identity. And that was very political. But that's what I mean when I say that he was a political animal, because he did not hesitate in doing this. He knew people were being jailed for advocating for independence. He knew there were many other things happening, and yet he continued talking and he continued working. I mean, the 18 years that he spent at the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture did an incredible amount of work in terms of preservation, in terms of creating educational materials, in terms of giving us a version of our own history. Old San Juan, you were mentioning the 500th anniversary of the founding of the city, became sort of a city museum in a way. People would walk around San Juan and feeling pride and taking pride in their ancestry, and that in a way is the direct result of his work.
I want to go back later to more of his work and his vision, but you mentioned something, Pedro, that I think it's really important, that the people got to receive a version of their identity, and I think that is one of the particularly problematic ideas that today resonate in a different way. You were talking about the seal of the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture, and that idea is something we've been talking a lot later the past years, because it's the idea of mestizaje as a way of erasing the Afro-Latino, the Afro-Puerto Rican experience, and there was a prevalence of that Puerto Rican identity, the idea that we are all mixed together, and because we're all mixed together, we could be okay under that umbrella, but that umbrella wasn't good for everyone, and a lot of people were left out of that umbrella. But also I agree with you, Carmen, in the fact that it's really difficult to judge a moment by the historical process of today. Again, we need to keep doing it, looking at the past and judging it, because it has effects still today. So that today there's still persons. For example, my husband, he's a black man, and when he goes to an audition, for a long time now, things have changed a little, but for a long time, his experience relates directly with that, because he doesn't look mixed race, and because he doesn't look mixed race, he doesn't look Puerto Rican, and he cannot have a role of a Puerto Rican. And that's something that has a lot to do with many other things.
With mestizaje and all that. Yeah. But the thing is, I think, Ana Teresa, that he opened the door a little bit.
Yeah.
So that the door could be opened wider, and it has been opened wider. Before that, there was utter invisibility.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have to really arrive at the time when this was happening, when there was nobody who talked about Black culture or Indian, Taino culture. The only Indians they talked about were the North American Indians. Yeah. Cherokee, they knew more about, like Pedro said, about the Cherokee or the Iroquois. So you have to put this in context, and I think I'm in full agreement that this kind of talk about mestizaje leaves out the essential characteristics of a race or a culture or whatever, and just jumbles it all together, you know. But then you have to think that at least there was a conscience there was an awareness there, and they were identified as Puerto Rican.
Yeah.
All the three let's say, cultures. After Alegría, we could not say I am Puerto Rican without taking into account the diversity and the richness, above all, of both cultures, because he was very insistent on displaying Black culture, Black art. He was responsible at the Museum of the Institute of the University of Puerto Rico of organizing the first exposition of Black art that ever was here.
That is very valuable, and
Exactly.
that is very, very important.
Can you imagine at that time? I was in the early 40s. People were probably scandalized to know Black art. What's that? It's in a way, it's provincialism in Puerto Rico, because in Europe, Black art had become very important since the turn of the 20th century. There was the force behind Cubism and Surrealism and all those isms in art.
I think we are looking at a figure that is one of these history figures that when you see the difficult parts of the project, then you find a way of understanding, and then it's problematic again, and then you find a way to justify the way it's problematic, and then again you can criticize it, and then you criticize it but feel so much admiration for all that was accomplished. How do you handle that kind of roller coaster of looking at him with admiration, but then having a very honest criticism, particularly with his political background that you explore more in your book?
One has to understand that Alegría had a work ethic that was unstoppable. He worked until his very last breath. The Alegría I met was almost 80, late 70s. He had been at the Centro de Estudios Avanzados since 1976 when he founded it. You need to understand that the Centro de Estudios Avanzados and the Museo de las Américas were his last two projects. One, a graduate center for education in literature and history, Puerto Rican literature and history, and the other, a museum devoted to art, folk art in the Americas. So he was always working, and he had a very strong vision of what he thought was correct. I engaged him, and we had differences because he created what he did at the Institute under such enormous pressure that in a way he thought people in the 80s and 90s should still devote the same time of energy to the projects he was dedicating his energy to in the 50s and 60s. And he like I said, he was relentless. He was like, this is my vision, this is what we should do.
And he was always writing a book. He had 5 or 6 books, because sorry I interrupt, but I'm just listening to you, and I feel like sharing that when he was doing that, I was working as a very young reporter in El Nuevo Dia, and I was assigned to the cultural pages, and sometimes we will have a doubt about a name. We will be looking for a detail about a piece or a photo, and we will call him to his house, and he will always pick up, and he will always say the same, give me a minute, and he will go away for 10 to 15 minutes, and he will go back with the answer, because he always knew where those specific answers were around his house. And that is really remarkable.
He slept from 3 or 4 in the morning till 9 or 10. So used to say that he would work late at night, and you would walk by his house and you would see his studio light on, which is one of the hardest things for me to do when I walk by his house, because the door was always open and he was there. He would his grandchildren lived with him. His family lived in a very big house in Old San Juan. So he was always working, but when he would complain about, young artists don't get it, they should be doing this, and that's not art, that's something else. I would say no, they're just being, they're just reflecting their time and the moment that they're living, just the same way you did, and
just the same way he did.
And he was sometimes very bitter. Young people don't get it. I'm like, no, they're just like you,
exactly,
because they they're responding to historical circumstances. And he felt, that perhaps people should pay more attention to what had worked for him, which was not necessarily the case so many years after. I think another aspect of the political animal is that he went beyond the bickering, the partisan bickering, and he would talk to his opponents. I mean, obviously he was in favor of sovereignty. Notice that when you read Alegría, he says, I am soberanista. He would not say independentista, which, in my opinion, was a stand he was taking, a different stand from the Partido Independentista, with whom he had a serious quarrel.
He had differences. Yeah.
But so he preferred to proclaim that he was soberanista instead of independentista, which basically meant the same. But then he would sit down with independentistas, or he would sit down with people from the Partido Nuevo Progresista. The mayors would come and knock on his door to ask for his advice, and he would give it. The governor would come and ask for his advice. It was not in the paper, but one day you could go into his house and you would see a prominent politician you would assume was his adversary walking out of his house. But he had that maturity to know that he needed to engage everyone who was willing to engage with him. And many, in my opinion, were wise enough to do it.
Except for somebody, Pedro.
Well, I know to
one person.
Oh, please share, please.
Romero Barceló. Yeah, of course.
I thought so. I think everyone.
Carlos Romero Barceló, was. When history is written, and he has since passed away, so it will be written soon. One has to say that Romero was very consistent in his views. He very inflexible.
Adamant.
And obviously they stood at different positions. But as we were talking, I was remembering that when I say that my generation, I started school in the early 70s, started, being educated differently from my mother or my grandparents. If you look at the generations before mine, my grandfather was a mulatto man from Puerto Tierra that had absolutely no expectation. He advocated for statehood, and he had no expectation that Spanish or Puerto Rican culture would survive. For him, statehood was the thing. It was equality. He loved Romero, by the way. But come 1979, and you can check this out. There's a great documentary. Come the Pan American Games here, and two instances are very, very reflective of what I'm saying. Puerto Rico, is hosting the Pan American Games, and in the final game in basketball, it was Puerto Rico versus the United States. You should watch the documentary New York Rican Basket. They're not. This is not a promotion, but you should watch it. New York Rican Basket does a great job of following this. I remember the tension in my house. We were all rooting for Puerto Rico except my grandfather, who couldn't get it. But we're like, why can't you just cheer for the Puerto Rican team? And it was, David versus Goliath. But that was like a moment in which I felt, wow, people here. Regardless of partisan politics, because I know people that were for statehood but that were rooting for Puerto Rico. And this was also the time when Romero was booed while giving a speech at the opening of the games, I think. And finally, when Jesus Cheyenne Basayo, who was Puerto Rican and swam for the U.S. national team, when he won in the Piscina del Escambrón a gold medal, the protocol called for the U.S. anthem, and the crowd instead, viva voce, gave him La Borinqueña. That was a remarkable moment.
And it's still,
yes,
you still can feel it in your skin.
So I think of those moments, and this is my opinion, as reflective of the result of what had been going on. Because take Pedro Rosselló, 1990s, as a statehooder. Rosselló, for example, was the first that decided that he needed to, in order to speak to statehooders, he had to speak with the symbols that had been used by populares. So you would see Rosselló with the Puerto Rican flag, something Romero would rather have died than appear beside the Puerto Rican flag. But Rosselló was like, I don't care. We can be a state in Spanish. We can have the flag. We can have the countryside, El Campo. And I remember watching him on TV the first time I saw Rosselló, and I said, game over. La semilla que sembramos, the seed we planted, because I said, game over. These people cannot speak about statehood without referring to
Yeah.
Puerto Rican culture was something which, in my opinion, was something that was avoided until then.
Something we have reflected on a lot of the aspects of his project as a, because I think of his life's work as a big vision board of ideas of pushing forward from different spaces, archaeological, sports, art,
History.
history, so
Yeah.
many places. And when he thought about Puerto Rican culture, he didn't left away the diaspora. And I think it's very
Oh,
relevant
that-
and
that-
important to
That
to talk about that.
I think it's very important because he was really a pioneer in recognizing the importance of the diaspora, not only in the States, but the diaspora, the importance of the diaspora for us back on the island,
To keep that relationship.
Exactly. And when programs of Puerto Rican studies were being set up in the States, in Buffalo, Lehman College, and different, he realized that they would need teachers who knew enough about Puerto Rico to teach those courses in those universities. That was at the end of the 60s, 68, 69, 70. He was very instrumental in having Lehman College set up a Puerto Rican Studies program. He recommended Dr. Maria Teresa Babin as its first the department head there. But he was not content with that. At the Institute in 1970, he set up a program of Puerto Rican studies, which I think is wonderfully foresighted. He established it. He took in students, 10, 11 at the most. He employed teachers, historians like Gervasio Garcia, like Francisco Pavón, like Antonio Gonzalez, a whole lot of Puerto Ricans who knew. And then he tried to attract Puerto Ricans or Americans who lived in the States who wanted to teach Puerto Rican studies to learn about them here, to learn about Puerto Rico here in the context of our life. And that was really a first for us. And a first for us and a first for the diaspora also.
Today is
And with-
stronger than ever.
And it was the precursor to the Centro de Estudios
Exactly.
Avanzados. That was it.
Exactly. Well, because that program became the Center for Puerto Rican Studies when he left the Institute. He took the program with him and he established it at Casablanca, the annex. And that's where the war with Romero Barceló heated up, because Romero didn't want that kind of studies at all. And Ricardo Alegria was frequently visited by people from Cuba or people from Venezuela or whatever. And Romero Barceló didn't want people like that coming here. And so he attempted to kick Ricardo Alegria out from the Casablanca, which was a museum. By that time, it was already a museum. He himself had fixed up. He had gone and bought period furniture and had remodeled it and everything. So by the time that Romero was mayor, the Casablanca was already an established museum. And Romero said he wanted it to live. He wanted the Casablanca as his house, as the house of the mayor of San Juan. And that's when the fight heated up. And he said, well, I'm going to take Alegría out of there. And Alegría, who was not one to back out of a fight, said, well, let him throw all my things in the street and see what happens when he throws all my things in the street. Who's going to be defended by the people? But so Romero then backed down. And he said, well, you can't go against Ricardo Alegría because it's like going against the Virgin Mary. So, pelear con Ricardo Alegría como pelear contra la Virgen María.
Yeah, there's an aura. There's a thing, and I wanted to ask both of you. Oh, I love that anecdote. And he was gonna be defended. I had the honor to cover his funeral for El Nuevo Dia, and it was the most immense, dramatic, beautiful funeral with a long procession of artists, of paintings, of dancers, of everyone who was involved, or almost everyone who was involved in Puerto Rican culture was there walking through the streets of San Juan to pay their respects in the Cementerio de la Perla, Santa Maria Magdalena de Pasis. And it was very emotional to be. I was down at the cemetery waiting for everyone to get there behind the coffin and the group of people. And that image is something I have very fresh in my mind because it really represented a lot. But what I wanted to ask both of you is about that aura, about that. Father figures are always problematic. It doesn't matter. You're a father, you should know. They're always problematic. And a lot of people consider Ricardo Alegría the father of Puerto Rican contemporary culture. I don't like father figures in that way, and I do believe it's problematic, but there's a meaning to the fact that a lot of people will think of him in that way. And what I wanted to ask you, coming from this idea, is if you will need to describe who was he for Puerto Rico, what are the words you will pick to describe this man for our Puerto Rican culture?
Well, I would say defender in the first place, researcher, a promoter, and what else, Pedro? Defender, deserter, promoter, teacher. He told me once, everything I do has a didactic purpose. Everything I do has a didactic purpose. If I do an exhibition on black art, it's because I want to show people the wonderful things that we have in black art. If I do an exhibition on archaeological artifacts, it's because I want to show people the richness of the indigenous culture here. You were talking about the books, his books for children were very didactic also, because it's not only los cuentos de los indios, sino like he had, for example, he did a lot of research, a book on Juan Garrido, the Black Conquistador, whom I had never in my life heard of, and he researched Juan Garrido, the Black Conquistador, and Miguel, El Rey Miguel, King Miguel, who was a Puerto Rican slave who was taken to Venezuela and fostered a slave rebellion in Venezuela. Generally, nobody knows about El Rey Miguel, but
and we should learn
we should
more.
Learn,
Yeah,
we should learn. Yes. So when he died, he left no less than 200 portfolios of research he had begun. He had research on everything from the artistic patterns of the scars, self-inflicted scars of certain African sectors. He had research on La India Juiza.
He collected African masks.
He collected African
and
masks.
African objects.
And,
I brought an African a friend of mine who is a historian specializing in Africa to his house one day, just for the two of them to talk about African history.
And who was this man to you and for us, for Puerto Rico?
I think he was a man who rised up to the challenge of defending, promoting, and educating about what it meant to be Puerto Rican at a time when being Puerto Rican was something that was not being talked about. I think he responded very, very bravely to some of the challenges, and thanks to that work ethic and that relentless character of his, he left a legacy that we're still talking about.
Our capital city is 500 years old, and he's a main figure of that history. I would like you, for as a closure, to share with us some thoughts, reflections, ideas on this figure in the context of this celebration. What should we do with his legacy? How does the good and the bad, the honorable and the critical parts of his legacy should serve us today?
Well, it's impossible to talk about San Juan now without talking about Alegría. Won't you agree?
No, totally.
But the thing is, he set out to give back to San Juan the grace he had known there, the graciousness he had experienced in San Juan as a boy, when there was a society that was more or less integrated, at a certain level. It wasn't, because he talked a lot about his friends in La Perla, in the place, in the Boulevard Nosagaray, where all the women from the islands, black women from the islands, used to sit and sell candies and sell this and that. So he had a vision of the San Juan he grew up in, where there was a lot of community. It was a very small city, of course. It was a lot of communication between the neighbors, be they black or white. I mean, maybe this is an idealistic view that he conserved from his childhood. Maybe if we were there, we wouldn't see it as rosy as he saw it. But that was his childhood remembrance, and he wanted to give back a livable, walkable city. He also restored many official buildings, of course, but his main thrust was the houses. He wanted the houses to be beautiful, to be graceful, to be lived in. And he wanted people to go back to San Juan and live in those houses. Yes. And I find that beautiful. He had a lot of trouble. He was insulted. Once he was menaced at gunpoint because the Institute set up some standards for how to fix up the houses.
Yeah.
But I'm older than you both. I saw San Juan before Alegría, and it was in shambles, literally in shambles. What is now El Hotel del Convento was it wasn't a church anymore or a convent anymore. It had a mechanical repair shop in the middle, where there is now the chapel and there was a repair shop there. Those rooms were little apartments, very, very small, very, very poor. And and San Juan was two cities. There always were small associations dedicated to the restoration of San Juan, and there had been laws also dedicated to the restoration of San Juan. But the big, basic restoration was made by Alegría to rescue the kind of city where you could be comfortable in and have a social life.
I think if we want to honor his legacy, the best thing we can do is not copy him. Unfortunately, Alegría was a man of his time, and he was very clever in, like I said, creating responses to. I think we should aim for the attributes, his relentlessness, his ferocity, his
character.
Exactly. I think we need to find ways to respond to our challenges using the best traits that he had. I think some people would like to think that if he were alive, things would be different. I think we honor him more by adopting the many stances he took to defy what was unjust, to defend a vision, and to do so, valiantly, without fear, with resolve. That's how I think of him. I think we face a great deal of challenges. San Juan is facing an anniversary under tremendous circumstances. You see some decay in the city and the lack of a broader project for the city. But we shouldn't give up. I think we need to fight, and we need to create ways to defend his legacy and to create our own. I think that's the best tribute we can pay to him.
Well,
Beautiful.
yeah,
Yeah, that's beautiful.
I absolutely agree. I want to thank both of you, not only for this conversation. I've learned so much, I've enjoyed so much your anecdotes, your memories, but also for creating these two books. Because if we're going to do that thing you are both describing, we need to start somewhere. So thank you for your work. Thank you for your time. I want to thank Al Centro for this opportunity, for being able to share with you this magnificent experience we've just had here in Trujillo Alto. And I want to remember to all of you that the next conversations will be on November 16th and November 23rd. The first one is titled San Juan Beyond Walls, Patrimonial Nominations en La Isleta, and it's coordinated by the Office of Historical Preservation that directs architect Carlos Rubio. The next one is titled San Juan Queer and is going to be presented by Javier Laureano and Celiani Rivera. We hope you join all of us here again. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Al Centro, and hope we see you soon again in this virtual space. Thank you.